Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to day 3 of the CEPAR International Conference. My name is Kaarin Anstey and I'm Co-Deputy Director of CEPAR, an ARC Laureate Fellow and Director of the UNSW Ageing Futures Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome everyone to the last day of the conference. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the unceded land of the Baird people, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present and extend that to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are with us here today or online. I'm really excited to introduce you all and welcome you to day 3. It's been a really fantastic conference so far and there's more to come, and I hope you've enjoyed the program as much as I have. And today there will be a number of concurrent sessions and a panel session after I've introduced the conference on Feminising and Ageing Workforces, Implications for Research Policy and Practice. The conference concludes today with closing remarks scheduled for 2:45 p.m. here at Leighton Hall. There have been a couple of changes to the program and they're noted in the online program and also at the entrance. So just before we start, I just wanted to go over a few of the ground rules so we have an enjoyable experience. Please remember to switch off your mobile phones. I'll switch mine off. The restrooms are located at the back, out there. In case of an emergency, please follow the signs to the fire exits. I meant to point them out. I'm not actually sure where they are, but I wonder if someone can point them. Yep, okay. The complete program, including breaks times, is available online on the CEPAR website, and there's also hard copies of the program at the registration desk. The panel sessions will be online, live streamed and recorded. And if you have any issues getting online or with the program, please see the registration desks or ask a member of the event staff. Okay, it's now my great pleasure to introduce you to the chairperson of this panel, Professor Marian Baird, AO. Marian is a CEPAR Chief Investigator, Professor of Gender and Employment Relations, Co-Director of the Women, Work and Policy Research Centre, and a presiding Pro-Chancellor in the University of Sydney. She's a very eminent and leading researcher in the fields of women, work and family, and is a highly recognised member of international networks on women, work and empowerment. And you can read Marian's full bio in the program. So please join me in welcoming Marian.
Well, thank you very much, Kaarin, for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land that wasn't ceded and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also draw our attention to the voice referendum and ensure that we all think about that very carefully and the importance of providing some constitutional recognition for our Indigenous Australians. This morning, our panel is focusing on feminising and ageing workforces and the implications for research and policy. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panellists, all of whom are experts in the area of both research and policy. So on my left is Professor Virpi Timonen. Virpi is an international scholar from Finland. She holds sort of dual positions, if I have this correctly, Professor of Social and Health Services Research and Leadership, and Professor of Social Policy at the University of Helsinki, and Professor in Social Policy and Ageing at Trinity College, Dublin. So Virpi is going to give us some insights in international trends in research and policy around ageing workforces and ageing populations, as well as the critical issue of gender. On my right, I'm really delighted to introduce Mr. Tim Johnson. Tim is Assistant Secretary with the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and is looking after, guiding, directing, doing a lot of work around the Care and Support Economy Taskforce. It's an incredibly important task force underway at the moment, looking at the care sector in childcare, aged care, disability care and veterans care. So as you can see, 4 critical areas of care that overlap exactly with the work we've been doing related to population ageing. I then have Associate Professor Myra Hamilton, who's a Senior Research Fellow with cepar and works with me at the University of Sydney on our Mature Workers and Organisations program. And I warmly welcome also Dr. Alexandra Heron, who is an Associate Investigator with cepar, also at Sydney University, and has some fantastic insights resulting from her very recently completed PhD, which looks very closely at what happens to working elder carers and how that intersects with policies, both national, state, and also organisational policies. So I'm really looking forward to this panel, which will try and tap into this problem or challenge we have in Australia and many countries where we have both ageing workforces and feminising workforces. And we also have, of course, ageing populations, and that creates a particular tension in trying to meet the needs of that ageing workforce at the same time as many of the carers are in employment and increasingly being asked to enter the workforce because our population sizes are in decline. So we have a really interesting mix of problems, and I'm hoping that we can untangle them a bit and investigate them with this panel. I'm going to ask each of the participants some questions, but I'm hoping that you're thinking about, as we're talking, some questions you'd like to ask. So at the end of our discussion here, we'll throw open to you as audience to hear from you about some comments you'd like to make or questions you have from our panellists. So thank you all. I'm going to begin with Virpi. And Virpi, I know you've only recently arrived in Australia to do some research, and you've spent a bit of time in Melbourne, now in Sydney. Welcome. I wonder if you could give us some insights and make some observations around the direction of research and policy when it comes to ageing, gender and work in Europe.
Okay, the first point in response to that would be that care is always highly contextualized, but because I think our time today will be better spent if we focus on the commonalities.
Yeah.
I'm going to sort of gloss over a lot of detail and nuance and, you know, individual welfare regimes and all the rest of it, and just focus on the commonalities. And in terms of what virtually all systems have in common, are two features, namely that caring remains extremely gendered everywhere, and secondly that care is very much a growth sector everywhere. So to start with the gendered aspect, even in those countries and systems that lean, relatively speaking, more towards formal care, care is still feminized. So let's say if you take Sweden and you look at the composition of the workforce working in aged care services, it's 90% female. So, you know, that just goes to show how even in countries that we regard as quite advanced in gender equality terms, care remains feminized. And I would actually argue that most challenges in care writ large arise from the low status accorded to care work, which of course goes hand in hand with the relatively lower status of women's work, traditionally seen in the familial sphere, and also the ongoing pay inequalities between men and women. And another layer to that, of course, is the fact that care work in the formal and in the semi-formal sector is increasingly something that's carried out by migrant women. The second commonality about care being a growth sector, I think everybody here knows the reasons for that, which are to do with population aging and with women's employment. So my very quick remark there is about how always when you have a growth sector, you have a lot of people interested in that, including these days, technology companies and certainly the European contexts that I'm familiar with are very excited and in some cases investing quite a lot into technology in care. And I'm not sure if we'll get around to discussing that. It's a very interesting realm, and my main argument there is that I am exceedingly wary about this perception that we have quick fixes through robotization and remote connections to older people being cared in their own homes. So against that backdrop of two big commonalities, another thing I would argue, and I think that there's awareness of this in policy circles, but not enough action with regard to care being a realm that is in need of quite profound disruption in a positive sense. And unsurprisingly, my argument would be that that need for disruption pertains especially to this gendered nature of care. But just a little disclaimer or caveat, even though later on I might be drawing on examples from the Nordic realm, I certainly don't mean to say that care has been sorted anywhere. I mean, a lot of the similar problems that are evident, I'm sure, in Australia, to do with labor shortages and skill shortages, for instance, are very much the case in the Nordic countries as well. And with regard to the disruption of the gendered nature of care, there's just maybe a couple of examples of what can make a difference. I think we have seen that when you make parental leave, a significant proportion of parental leave based on quotas for both parents, which are not substitutable or tradable between the parents, that does prompt greater involvement of fathers in the care of their children, which through the life course then ultimately will feed into different patterns of caregiving in midlife and at older ages. Although, interestingly, at older ages, it's just a sheer force of demographics that has actually brought about more male carers, because men's life expectancy has increased, so increasingly they are also in a position to look after their aging spouse or partner. And interestingly, we actually see some grandfathers who had very traditional roles in their earlier lives, sort of grasping a second chance. I actually had a PhD student who wrote about grandfathers becoming involved in grandchild care under sort of big label of redemption theory. So there are some older men who want to sort of redeem something of their earlier lives. And in terms of formal policies, I think we talk a lot about how we need to make it easier for women to combine care and work. So that should clearly be about everybody, and with a particular emphasis maybe on men being able to combine those two realms. And this is where, I got to show my Nordic colors for the first time. I think that kind of disruption in the private realm, which can be done up to a point through policies, really also needs to be underpinned by strong formal care services. And there the key word, I think, is improving the quality of care work. Because I think the best route towards better care at the point of receiving that care is through improving the quality of care work. So we actually have some sort of apparent paradoxes here. So hopefully it makes sense against the backdrop of what I've just said and what all of you already, I'm sure, know, that if you are concerned about older women's employment, really, you should be concerned about childcare services, because these things are not separate. They're very much intertwined. And really, I think to wrap up, my final comments to open up this conversation with would be that we need to see care and expenditure on care as investment. It is already seen as investment when it comes to the early childhood care and education sector. I think a lot of countries have embraced that idea. But care, more broadly speaking, I think will pay very considerable dividends, especially in that realm of gender division of labor, if we really invest into it. And I think certainly policy actors in that space should be quite unashamed about that. I think it's not easy in a world where everybody's clamoring for the expenditure, but making a difference and disrupting care in a positive way will cost money. And I think we should be sort of unashamed about that because it's been undervalued for too long.
Thanks, Virpi. That is actually a fabulous opening and takes me directly to our next panellist to talk about the formal care sector in Australia. I do want to say that we have to keep in mind that when we think about the provision of care in any economy, the connection between the formal sector and the informal sector is so close and tight and actually inextricably linked that we have to really understand that policies we introduce in one affect policies in the other. But in Australia, I think we're heading for, perhaps, that positive disruption that Virpi has called for. And Tim Johnson, as I said at the beginning, is one of the leads of the Care and Support Economy Taskforce in Australia, which is looking into this very question. So Tim, can you give us a bit of a background on what that task force is doing, why it was put together, and what you hope to gain, or what the government hopes to gain from that task force?
Yeah, thanks, Marian. So our task force is Australian Government Task Force. We were stood up at about the end of last year in December to develop a national strategy for the care and support economy. So in our terms of reference, that covers aged care, disability support, early childhood education and care, and support for veterans. The reason sort of behind this is these are all sectors that are, for us, that are predominantly Australian government funded. The demands on care, the volume of care, and therefore the cost is increasing, and all experiencing particularly workforce shortages growing and emerging, and it was probably the workforce shortage bit that was really the original and key driver. In Australia last year, we had a significant case awarded for a pay increase to aged care workers, which was great, but then the immediate, and my colleagues in the Federal Department of Health had modelling that said X% wage increase is needed to fill all the workforce shortages across aged care. And it's like, okay, that's great. Where are people going to come from? In a world of less than 4% unemployment and shortages everywhere, most likely that's just going to shift workforce shortages to the adjacent sectors and result in lack of access to care somewhere else. So really some of the crux of the starting point was, well, how do you fix your workforce shortages in a holistic way across all kind of care sectors, and for us starting with what we fund as our kind of starting point, although that has flow-on effects to kind of all sorts of adjacent things as well. But then actually as we got into it as well, or even from the start, it wasn't just about the workforce shortage. There's also, as Virpi said, around the need to improve the quality of care was clearly a very significant thing. And for the government, the question is, how do you do all this while making it sustainable and affordable? So already looking across the sectors we're looking at, they are Commonwealth expenditure is significantly increasing, not just in real terms, but as a proportion of the budget, trending up towards about 15% of the budget over the next few years, which on current trajectory with an ageing population will just, and increasing demands for both the volume of care and the quality of care would just increase at a rate that, well, in the current environment is not really sustainable. So our job is looking across all of these things. So in this national strategy that we developed, which the Prime Minister released a draft of at the end of May for consultation, so we set, I guess, a vision or a goal across how the government will see these sectors, which is pursuing quality care with decent jobs and that's sustainable. And set those 3 goals actually quite deliberately all at the top, because like quality care that focuses on individuals, that delivers people who need care and support. And sorry, I should always say care and support, because for many people with disability, it's not care they need, it's just support to live, to do things they need to do, want to do. So the quality care is clearly at the centre, but you want to have that as well with the people delivering that having good jobs, which has often not been the case. Certainly I was in one stakeholder consultation with the CEO of a large not-for-profit, and I think I said, these are not seen as good jobs. And she stopped me and said, no, Tim, these are not good jobs. It was as blunt as that, poorly paid, unsafe, and a lot of insecure work. I was very surprised to discover that personal care and support workers is the most injured occupation in Australia, more than labourers, which I was quite surprised by. And then against those goals as well for the government as the major funder of all these services, actually making that sustainable. So we could have a great, wonderful care system with excellent, well-paid jobs that cost 50% of the budget and would not be sustainable for the government in our economy. So the question of how you pursue all those things all at the same time is what we're grappling with. And the strategy that we've released is really setting a framework for how the government will think about it. So it doesn't get into solving all the problems, but as you make changes over years or decades, having a framework for approaching that to make sure you achieve those goals is the key.
Tim, in the development of that strategy and in the stakeholder engagement that you've done, I know you've been doing consultations around the country with many, many different groups. Does the issue of gender come up specifically? Because we can talk about this as a workforce issue, but it's a segment of the workforce. This workforce, as Virpi said, everywhere is highly feminised.
Yes, absolutely. And actually there's, in the strategy, if you want to read it on Prime Minister and Cabinet's website, there's a very significant chapter about gender in it. So ageing clearly is part of it in terms of our ageing workforce and therefore increasing demand for aged care particularly. But gender came up very strongly, so in quite a variety of things. So gender is part of, increasing women's workforce participation is both a driver of the need for care. So one of the things that all the sectors we're looking at, maybe not veterans as much, but certainly the other care sectors have in common is that it's all work that would have traditionally been done in the home, which means by women. And we're interested in how that's moving into the formal economy, which frees particularly therefore women up to participate in the workforce, but also the fact that women are increasingly participating in the workforce is the driver of it as well. And as Virpi said, yes, this is still predominantly done by women. Our stats, I think, in general is not as high as 90% in Australia. It's more like 75%, but still very high. And it is undervalued as well for, probably for the same reasons. The other way of looking at it would be that because it's not something that was valued in society, government has stepped in to fund it, and therefore it's not a market in a sense. It's not like you're buying an iPhone that people are willing to pay for. People have not valued paying for it themselves, and I think therefore has been a driver to not invest in it in the same level as many government-funded things are, unfortunately, just in the nature of the trade-offs of all the things that government needs to do. But in any event, yes, that was certainly came through in our research and our consultations as the undervaluing of work has been a key factor in it. Yep.
Thank you. And maybe we'll come to this a bit later, but just to sort of flag it as an issue that perhaps increasing the pay of care sector workers, one of the ideas behind that too is it may shift the attractiveness of that sort of work to the workforce in general, and more men may enter. But we haven't seen that happen necessarily in any other country either, and I might talk to Virpi about some other research about the sort of the way in which that work is perceived, apart from the money, but the actual work itself. So Myra, I'm going to come to you now, and just sort of to continue with this theme about thinking about the increasing participation rates of women in the workforce, which is what Tim was also just talking about. And we have seen a real shift in older women, 45 and above, entering the paid labour market. Can you comment on how applying a gender lens to our research and policy can help us prepare better for the future of work and the provision of care?
Thanks, Marian. Yeah, I mean, I think a gender lens is absolutely essential to understanding the ageing profile of our labour market. You know, in Australia, since 1991, older workers have doubled as a proportion of the labour market, driven mainly by workers aged 55 to 64. And these changes have largely been driven by public policies aimed at extending working lives, like delaying the retirement age, enabling people to draw retirement incomes and continue working, wage subsidies for employers, employing older workers, and so on. And what this means is that organisations are increasingly confronted with workforces of an older age profile and are juggling the complexities of managing an increasingly age-diverse workforce. And we see that on the one hand, offering policies that support mature age workers can have very positive outcomes for workers and for employers, improving things like retention. We also see in the literature that singling out older workers for particular workplace policies can also, in some respects, deepen stereotypes and age bias within organisations. So public policymakers and organisations are really grappling with the complexities associated with the ageing profile of the labour market. But to date, all of this work on longer working lives and age diversity in the labour market has really been missing, largely missing a gender lens. And you know, the work that we've been doing in our stream of work in cepar has really been trying to shine a light on how important it is to understand gender and linked to that care in the way we understand the ageing profile of the labour market. This is because the trend in increased labour market participation by older workers has been accompanied by a trend in increased labour market participation by women, but often these things are treated separately, you know, in policy and research. And certainly often in policy, we see women's labour market participation initiatives, you know, taking place over here, and initiatives focused on mature age labour market participation and active ageing and productive ageing and so on going on over here, and there doesn't seem to be very much focus on the intersections between the two trends. So we've been trying to say that really, when understanding mature age labour market participation, we really have to understand the gender dynamics. I mean, while overall mature age labour market participation has increased, when you actually break it down, this has largely been driven by the widespread increase in participation by older women. And over the last few decades, we see a very large increase in the labour market participation of older women and actually a slight decrease in labour market participation by older men. So really suggesting that this is a highly gendered phenomenon that we need to think about through a gender lens. So a fundamental part of this issue is care and understanding the role of care in shaping the dynamics of mature age labour market participation and age diversity in the labour market. Because the existing work on the ageing workforce doesn't engage in very much detail with the notion of older workers' unpaid care responsibilities. We know that the proportion of Australians who have unpaid care responsibilities actually increases with age until about the age of 65. So that early cohort of mature age labour market participants in the sort of ABS definition of 45 plus are among the most likely to have unpaid care responsibilities for a family member with a disability, a chronic illness, or a frail older relative. So just to give you an example, about 1.3% of those aged under 15 years provide unpaid care for a person with a disability, a chronic illness, or an ageing relative, and about 20% of those aged 55 to 64 years are providing that level of unpaid care. So more than half of Australia's unpaid carers are in this cohort of 45 to 74 years that we often talk about when we often refer to when we're talking about mature age workers. So we can see a large proportion of Australia's ageing workforce has unpaid care responsibilities for family members with a disability or chronic illness. And we know from our work in our stream that this has really considerable impacts on labour market participation, so the number of hours of unpaid care and also the level of strain associated with that care, whether it's stressful, how much it interferes with work, has really considerable impacts on workforce withdrawal. Alongside that form of unpaid care, it's also very common for older workers to combine paid work with the regular care of grandchildren, and this is something that Virpi and I have been working on and that Virpi discussed a little bit. In Australia in 2020, more than 20% of grandparents with a grandchild aged 13 or under provided childcare in a typical week. So we see a really substantial proportion of older workers are carrying out care for young children, and many of those will be combining care of grandchildren with care of another relative. So the impacts on their labour market participation can be very considerable, and we know from the grandparents' work that we've done that grandparents are regularly adjusting their labour market participation to accommodate their grandparenting responsibilities. At the same time, research suggests that unpaid care is a major reason driving labour market exit among older workers, and we see unpaid care provision reported as a reason for retirement. So all this is highly gendered, of course, so among people aged 55 to 64 years, the number of female primary carers is almost double the number of male primary carers, and we know that among grandparents providing regular childcare, they're much more likely to be grandmothers, and where grandfathers are involved in the regular provision of childcare, they're more likely to be involved in different kinds of childcare activities like play-based activities or transporting children to and from activities, which don't interfere with work in the same way as routinised care responsibilities like bathing and feeding and so on. So really kind of to summarise, I guess, the ageing profile of the workforce is driven by women, and many of them will have substantial care responsibilities that shape their work decisions, their work behaviours and their work preferences. And so it's really essential to take a gender lens when we're thinking about the ageing profile of the labour market, and also to think about the intersections between gender and ageing in public policy making and organisational policy making in the context of the ageing workforce.
Yes, thanks, Myra. That just really reminds me of my own life, and I think many people in the Australian population now are really experiencing that double tension between childcare or grandparent care and aged care or care of people with a disability in their families. Myra, you really highlighted for me the fact that it's not just putting a gender lens on these issues in the care economy as well as the labour market, it's making visible what is often has been regarded as invisible, not just undervalued, but hasn't been recognised as an actual service to the economy. And that's a really important shift, I think, in some of the research that's now undertaken, but also in policy, as Tim is starting to see in his work. But the other thing, of course, that it really hits the ground when people are in workplaces, in organisations, and they have to ask for time off work. Work that Alex, Heron and I have been doing shows that elder care, or providing care for an aged parent or relative, is quite different to childcare, because it's intermittent, you don't know when it's going to occur, it's highly intense when it does occur, it doesn't need the same long periods of time off, for example, as parental leave might, but it will need lots of bits of leave. So how does this play out in an actual workplace? So Alex, I know that you've done a really deep and thorough study of organisations in Australia, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what you found in your research in the way in which care and gender and informal provision of care plays out.
Right, yes, thank you, Marian, who was, you know, the most wonderful supervisor of this research. My recent PhD research was into informal and unpaid elder care undertaken by families and friends who are themselves working. And as we all work longer and our parents' lives lengthen, I think this is an issue which is going to increase in significance. Really, there are two things I want to say, which is its invisibility, which is gender-related. It is profoundly invisible in society, and that affects the statistics we collect, the law we pass, the organisational policies that are created, and ultimately the carers themselves. Grandparental care, which Myra's talked about, is a hugely significant part of older workers' care commitments. But my focus was entirely on elder care in 2 private sector organisations, but I also did an analysis of Australian workplace legislation on flexible working and carers leave, which just to show the historical development of that and its various gaps as far as elder carers were concerned. Many examples of good practice existed in my organisations, which were leading employers and really interested in this issue and improving their practice. One was in finance and one in manufacturing. But even so, there were real silences around elder care. I think of 2 chaps I talked to. They felt they had to camouflage what they were doing, one by saying he was taking a day working at home looking after his son when he went to visit his mother as well, and the other who said that he was going to his holiday home at weekends rather than to visit his parents. I mean, he had a holiday home, but it was near his parents. And other people felt that it was just too sad a topic, a tale of woe, and couldn't be brought into the workplace. I mean, if you think about it, you don't often whip out photos of your elderly parents to show around the workplace in the way that you do grandchildren and children. So the invisibility really leads to an under-acknowledgement in organisation of what elder care involves, and that in turn discourages disclosure, which then leads to further under-acknowledgement. I think elder care's unseen for numerous reasons. The first really is its gendered nature. I mean, men do a lot of elder care for their parents. They do it differently often. They do different bits. But they do suffer the same gendered difficulties women do, and that was apparent in the few men that came forward to be interviewed. They often felt quite lonely about what they were doing. It wasn't a topic, it was even less of a topic in their workplaces than elsewhere. And I think it's understanding the multiplicities of small tasks. That's Bose et al. In the UK wrote that. It's hard to perceive how much work there is involved until you're actually involved in it, as several interviewees said to me. And a lot of this can't be contracted out. You can't contract out monitoring the formal care. You can't contract out managing finances. You can't contract out keeping a real eye on health management, as Marian and I were talking earlier, of an older parent. And Virpi's written about this in terms of it being part of the broader caring scape, that sort of managerial care. And Sue Himmelwhite's also written about that sort of care that can't be bought is often particularly unseen, and I think that's highly relevant to elder care. I also would just like to say the state was really absent in a lot of the interviews I did until people went into residential care. People just didn't know about care in the home. I mean, it was startling. That was one of the recommendations I made to the organisations, that we do need people can be told as employees about the existence of that. And the implications are that wider society, if it doesn't understand how much elder care is done, informal elder care, and how central it is to society's caring for older people and to the formal system, that lack of understanding sort of cascades down, and it impacts statistics that are collected, and again, how we see it, legislation, organisational policies, and then the carers themselves. If society doesn't see informal elder care, it's unlikely that the legislation will cater for it properly. And I think that much research, including mine, but mostly the other research being quantitative, is that public policy forms a baseline for the development of organisational policies. If government can't get it focused and correct for what is needed, and I think that's particularly true of carers' leave at the moment. If the government can't get it right, you can't really expect the bulk of organisations to do that. And where organisational policy is inadequate, elder carers suffer in terms of the emotional toll of the informal elder care. But they also suffer in terms of not just career progression, but I found a lot of people were just not getting the bonuses that so many of them relied on now, even to quite a low level, because this is more of a hidden penalty for full-time workers. Work detriment is often phrased in terms of the number of hours people work, but actually, given the extent of bonuses in a lot of jobs, if you can't get your bonus, that's a sort of hidden and disguised penalty, because you're working full-time. It's not apparent what you're losing to the outside eye, so to speak. So really, yes, I would say that following on, the gendered nature of the care is really what leads to its invisibility fundamentally, and that has such huge flow-on effects to everything else. I think that those are the two main points that really came out of my PhD.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I mean, I think what's really important about what you said there was that recognising the importance of people who help care for older people to stay at home. Now, most countries around the world now have ageing at home or ageing in place policies in some way, and yet a lot of our research is focused on the formal sector, on how we fund that, and yet that sector can't exist without the support provided in the informal sector by people who are supporting people who are ageing at home, even with the government supports going into those homes. So it's a very complex area. I want to just come back to Virpi for a moment, because Virpi's done some really interesting research on care workers in Ireland. So we're flipping between those workers who work in the formal sector and those workers who provide informal care to their parents or relatives. But I'm moving back to the formal sector for a moment, and the work you did in Ireland on care workers, Virpi, I was really struck by this phrase in one of your papers, where you talk about the ambivalent social construction of the home care worker. So these are the workers who go into homes to provide that home care. What do you mean by that ambivalent social construction?
So this actually came out of a study that was, as I mentioned earlier, one of the perceived potential quick fixes in this realm is technology. So, you know, those kind of perceptions direct what is funded. So we're actually doing a study about perceptions of the use of technology or the potential of technology in care. But as we were doing this research, and as we were interviewing and focus grouping various professionals involved in the care sector in Ireland, home care for older adults specifically. So this would have comprised, let's say, physiotherapists and managers, owners of home care companies, GPs, etc. Various individuals who had specific roles and titles and statuses in the care sector. When we examined the way in which they were talking about the actual caregiving situations in the home and the people who were delivering this care on a daily basis, we just noted this wild ambivalence in the kind of language they used about the care workers. So they were sometimes portrayed as entirely saintly, amazing, wonderful people. And at the other extreme, they were maybe portrayed as perhaps straightforwardly as thieves. Some of these people, they steal from the clients, and they sometimes rush them, which is totally inappropriate. You can't rush somebody with Parkinson's disease. So that really piqued our interest as researchers, and we wanted to understand what is going on here. And obviously it is quite a long story, but at the end of the day, we were able to employ and make use of this concept of structured ambivalence, which means that kind of ambivalence, it just doesn't come out of nowhere. There are structural, institutional mechanisms that give rise to such perceptions, which you wouldn't have about any other group involved in the care of older people. So it really goes back to the precariousness of the work, the unpredictability of even the weekly hours of work, and the sort of deep commodification of this work, where it's kind of sliced into sometimes even like 15-minute slots of get this done, you've got to get this done, and you've got to go to the next person, you've got to be there by 3 o'clock. And then, our argument regarding the solution to this was, well, you just have to lift the status of these people. They have to come on a par with the professionals who are describing them as this kind of bizarre bundle of qualities and behaviors that are totally contradictory.
Well, that takes me back to Tim, I think. It's a nice way of saying, Tim, what can we do about that in Australia? If you've got a moment to talk about that, and maybe make some comments about how we get or think about those older women in the workforce that Myra mentioned. What's happening to them in Australia right now? And then we'll go to some questions. So,
sure.
Tim.
So on the particular thing that Virpi was referring to, we've seen that. I'd say that what we've heard, the Australian situation is not so far different. It's behavioural economics team in my department did some research about workers in the NDIS scheme, our National Disability Insurance Scheme, and that kind of feeling that they can't do the job that they want to be there for to do because they're rushed or whatever is one of the top 3 reasons people are planning to leave the sector, along with not feeling valued and poor safety. So the top 3 reasons people want to leave that sector. So yeah, it's a thing. I guess my bit of looking at it, there's a question about how do we value things like that has really come up in our work, and as a policy advisor, that's really hard for governments to do. Government has lots of levers around funding and regulation and all sorts of things, but changing attitudes is not one of them. So there is a broader thing there about and in our strategy, it kind of finishes with saying we need to have a national conversation about how these things are valued and what's the value we place on them. And I think that's the answer. Yes, government can play a role in leading that conversation, but there's got to be it's a bigger thing that you need a national conversation about changing value. Within the particular bits we're looking at, one of the things we are the thing that came up time and again is there is a complex, aside from kind of questions of value, but there's a complex interaction of funding models, pricing within them, like how particular services are priced, regulatory settings, so laws, but down through to kind of operational policy, and then kind of how our industrial relations instruments are structured around how people are paid and when they work and those sort of things. And the way those things all interact creates sort of incentives and disincentives, business models. But for our task force, kind of like looking at that and going, okay, well, how do you unpick that? You know, if it's just across aged care, but then that's got flow-on effects to the adjacent sectors about disability care or home care, residential care, childcare. Like, they actually interact in a quite complex way, and we're trying to think, well, how do you unpick that all those factors all at once across the whole system? That's incredibly complex. But that's what we're thinking about.
But it sounds like it has to be done.
Yeah.
Because we're at crisis point, basically, in many of our care sectors, aren't we? And those changes have to come through. Are there any questions or comments from the audience? Just raise your hand and the mics will come over to you. Thank you to our colleagues. Anyone want? Oh, yes, there's one. Sorry, right up the back there. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate the panel's focus on intersectionality, looking at age and gender. I wanted to just add another one to the mix, which is ethnicity.
Yes.
And the comment earlier about a lot of care workers being migrants. And so I'd like to ask the panel to comment on two aspects of that. And the first being the level of racism that these workers often experience in the care workforce, which is often not talked about. And the second one being a deficits-based model that is attributed to these workers, wherein they're assumed that we'll just fill them up with knowledge and training and skill and off they'll go, and not really harnessing many of the, I guess, soft cultural skills that they possess in delivering care.
Thank you, and I'm so glad you raised that, because that was running through my mind as well, that this particular workforce is not only gendered, but it is also often based on groups of women, usually from migrant backgrounds. So Virpi, did you want to comment on that and the implications? And then
as I said in my opener, a major layer or dimension to the gendered nature of the workforce in these sectors is that it is also increasingly, in the countries that I'm most familiar with, composed of women who are migrants, foreign-born, who are coming into the country to work in this sector. And that's, of course, another huge question about these sort of so-called global chains of care, which, again, they go back to inequalities on a global scale. It's a while ago since I did research in this field, but what I do recall is also that it is the experience of the care workers themselves is quite varied, and because there are, unfortunately, quite strong stereotypes around, let's say, care workers from the Philippines being somehow particularly suited to this sector, and then maybe from other contexts, they're viewed with suspicion. And one of the unfortunate behaviors there is that there's a lot of writing off of racism on the part of the care recipients on the grounds of, don't worry about it, they're confused or they're not used to this. So then it really becomes quite a sort of major onus on the people who are managing and who are, actually supposed to be taking charge of racism at all levels in the work context of how do they deal with that, because certainly writing it off as don't worry about it, this is the way these people are is not okay, and I mean it sort of often goes together with the undervalued nature of this care sector. I think the solutions here really go back to the status and giving people stepping stones to acquiring qualifications, and also sort of flagging routes to progression within the care sector. And I think that, you know, should apply regardless of, you know, where you are coming from to work in this sector.
So Tim, just very quickly to you, another policy area then is immigration policy. And skill formation. Do you want to briefly comment on how those may interact with all the other policy areas you're looking at?
Yeah, sure. Clearly things we've looked at, I'd say, well, yes, we're interested in skill formation. Like the jobs are typically lower skilled jobs, or certainly the entry level ones. One of the things that came up is often there isn't career progression, there isn't a pathway, but we're interested in kind of what would that look like, because that's clearly got to be part of the mix of making it more attractive and better work. Migration, and yes, as per the question, like we certainly came up about the racism and the way Virpi talked about, like clearly featured in the work we looked at. Migration, two-edged sword, I'd say, is probably how I'd put it. Like certainly with this, a lot of providers would like to see much more immigration into these sectors to fill their workforce. When we went out for public consultation, people who were receiving plenty of racist comments from people receiving care, complaining about the ethnicity of their workers and whatnot, can't speak English, etc. But even more broadly, just structurally, it's not even going to be a panacea for the workforce shortages for a variety of reasons about constraints within Australia about housing and other social infrastructure and health and all sorts of things that my colleagues doing the employment white paper and Treasury would say, if you added up all the workforce shortages in every industry in Australia, it's more people than we'll have in the country for the foreseeable future. And you can't just import that many people. So redistributing kind of workforces where they need to be across the economy, making things that can be made more productive to free up workers, better skill formation, those are all, increasing workforce participation is probably the bigger game for government than just bringing in a lot of people.
Yes. Myra, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I just had a small extra comment. A nice example, I think, of the where care services and care policy and migration policy come together is in the area of grandparenting. We've done some work with migrant families about the use of grandparent care. And the families that we speak to, the parents often report having additional barriers to accessing the formal early childhood education and care market for a range of reasons. For example, they're on low incomes or in precarious work and are unable to afford it. If they're here on temporary visas, they don't have the same sort of access to things like the childcare subsidy and parental leave. They talk about not having access to culturally appropriate formal childcare services, and so grandparents become a very important source of childcare that enable the adult parents to participate in the paid labour market, but there are very serious constraints in the migration system to bringing grandparents over to provide childcare in migrant families. So, you know, the options for permanent migration are either what's called a contributory visa, which costs $50,000 per grandparent, or there's a non-contributory visa, which is much, much cheaper, but there's a 30-year waiting period. So what we find is that many of the families that we spoke to were using recurring visitor visas, cobbling together very complex childcare arrangements that were highly interrupted, and it had very serious consequences both for the labour market participation of the adult parents, who were really struggling to have continuity of employment when their sources of childcare were constantly having to come and go, but also for the capacity of their ageing parents to age well. When they were constantly at the whim of a really complex migration system and its requirements to be moving in and out of the country constantly.
Thank you, Myra. And Alex Heron.
And I interviewed a few non-English speaking migrant background workers who were elder carers, And I was struck by the extra burden on them of often having to be translators as well, and it put an extra additional pressure on them to be available to do that task.
Yeah. And on your question about the skill deficit model, I think that's a very interesting point. Sometimes decisions about these things come in other fields, and the relatively recent industrial relations decision for social and community healthcare workers was very significant in this regard, that it started to redefine what the skills are in the aged care sector and to move away from classically defined male skills and move into identifying many more of those what we would have referred to as invisible skills that are needed in that sector. Awareness of what an older person needs, emotional contributions to that person's care. So that sort of area is shifting, and I think that's a positive move. So we are seeing some changes, but there's still a lot to be done. Well, there's one more question. Have we got time for one more? Thanks, Amy.
Thank you for a really enlightening panel. So my question was sparked by something said near the beginning, which is about how public investment can then release labour force participation for a lot of women. And thinking about that and thinking about how you've got a limited public funding available, which would you invest in, you know, was going to be my question. But is it a fair comparison to say that, you know, you'd be investing in childcare versus elder care, whether you would even put them on a hierarchy of thinking about it like that? So I just wondered whether you had some thoughts about it, especially since the strategy is going to have to think about limited funds and how they're used.
Thanks, Raf. I think we'll ask each of the panellists to respond to that. That might be our final comment. It's a good one and not an easy one if you don't want to respond. The question is, if you had a hierarchy of needs, where we have a hierarchy of needs, where would you put your dollar first? Childcare, elder care, disability. That's the question, Raf, is that right? Yeah. Or how do we prioritise?
Question in that way.
Sorry?
Whether it's fair to even ask that question in that way.
Or whether it's fair to ask that question,
you know, because
in that
for
way.
different
That's
reasons you might want to invest in different things.
So we'll start with Virpi, Tim, Myra, and then Alex, if you'd like to.
Yeah.
Or a final comment from each of you.
There actually really doesn't have to be a trade-off. If you look at public expenditure, it tends to be the countries that spend most on childcare also spend most on elder care. So they actually go hand in hand. But I suppose, like, you know, if you were in a situation where there was this social construction that you have to choose, which I don't really agree with, but let's say you live in such a world, and that's the debate, then if pushed, yeah, I mean, most people would go for childcare because it has a longer term of potential return, and because it does actually quite straightforwardly tie in with participation of parents, and increasingly. Like, we're not just talking about working mothers anymore, we're talking about working grandmothers. So it does have the potential to link into that as well.
Thank you, Virpi. Tim?
I don't really have much to add, but I would probably say that economic policymakers probably echo what Virpi said, which is, you know, childcare is seen as a very strong social investment, other things less so. That said, maybe there's some bits of change in that. Like I'd say, it's not a settled argument. So certainly in Australia, a national disability insurance scheme was seen as a kind of definitely as a social investment. So there are differences. But yeah, probably it would be the same. If you had to pick, early childhood is probably because of the life course effect, like the number of multitude of flow-on effects that are well researched. But yeah, I wouldn't. It's hard to say. Yeah.
Thank you, Tim. Myra.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I would say that if the return on investment that you're looking for is an increase in female labour market participation or labour market participation in general, but a lot of the discussion around investment in care services is focusing on the outcomes for women's labour market participation. I would suggest that most people across their life courses provide multiple forms of care. Care for children, care for ageing relatives, care for other family members. And so if you had a system that focused only on one form of care, investing in one form of care, it may be that, not investing in the other form of care is, so investing in childcare, for example, may boost a woman's labour market participation. But if we don't also invest in aged care, that same woman may reduce their labour market participation because they also have responsibilities to care for an ageing relative either at the same time as a child or at another point in the life course. So I think investing in all of them, will have the best payoff if what we want is to boost women's labour market participation across the life course.
Thanks, Myra. And Alexandra.
Well, it's just, yes, I think it's very much what everyone has said, but I think it's about envisaging the care obligation that each of us have at different stages of our lives just needs to be much more woven into our daily lives and our working lives and a much greater understanding of that.
Thank you, Alex. And if I'll have a comment on that as well, I'd say that maybe it's time not to look at that economy as separate parts, but to refer to the care economy as a whole and how critical that is to our total economy. And not just our economy, our society. So that I think is a really important point that all of us, I'm sure, will agree on. It's a care economy we're now talking about. And this is not something that's unusual in economic circles now. Increasingly, we hear about organisations discussing the care economy. The World Health Organization, OECD, ILO, APEC are all now focused on this thing called the care economy. So what we've talked about today are all have been critical parts of that care economy, and I really want to thank our panellists, and I ask our audience to thank them as well. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And I think we have morning tea now.